I've created some handouts for you all, and there's a link to them on this first page here, and I also posted it in the chat, so that should take you directly there. The one main reason that I did that is because we're going to be talking about a framework, and hopefully it'll be visible well enough on our PowerPoint here, but I wanted you to have it so you could refer to it if you need to. So I wanted to set this up where you would be able to talk and ask questions. So that's why I have this little note about if you have a question, just indicate in the chat box, and I will do my best to follow along and stop and answer. You're welcome. Stop and answer any questions that you have. But my plan is to first present this framework, and then I've got a couple of little activities for you to try it with, or at least take a look at how I use it in the classroom, and then we can talk about that a little bit. Let's see if I still have it as a, there we go. There we go. Should be repeated now. All right, so I'm going to go to the next slide. This webinar is called Demystifying Contextualization. It's tips for the classroom. This is, and I'll talk about myself first. So my name is Valerie Ambrose, and I am a reading instructor at Shasta College in California. We're up in Northern California, really close to the border. So not just, you know, Northern California is in Sacramento, but Northern California is in a couple hours from Oregon. I'm also one of the cable co-directors. When Christy and I were trying to figure out what to do for our first webinar, I was like, well, I've given this workshop before, so maybe we can give this a try. And after this, if you have any ideas of people or other concepts for webinars, please let us know. That'd be great. I am a practitioner, really. I have taught developmental ed and adult basic ed, GED, for about 9 years now. But I also went back and got my PhD in educational psychology and research from Tennessee. And so I've taught graduate education as well. I'm actually adjuncting a class right now in the local area because they needed someone to teach ed psych. And I also taught high school language arts a while back. So most of what I'm going to be showing you is connected to developmental ed or adult basic ed English, because that's my background. But this framework can be used in a lot of different ways. So that's me. So the first thing I want you to think about really is, what is contextualization? What comes to mind when you think about it? I'm going to give you a couple minutes or a minute or two just to type some stuff in the chat box. What do you think? Real life, yeah. Yes, that's a great point. Students should never have to ask, when will I ever use this? Because they should know if it's contextualized, right? Good.
Oh, I'm getting some feedback.
Yep, I'm gonna mute somebody, I think. Yeah, people's environment to develop instruction, yep. Connecting academic content to contexts that are meaningful to students. Yeah, you all are putting in some great ideas. The one that we used when we were developing this, the main one that we focused on, is actually from Mazzeo, Rab, and AAACEd, and it's right here on your screen now. But basically, instructional strategies that are supposed to link the skills that you're using to the actual either academic or an occupational real-world context. This was primarily focused, again, on more developmental and adult basic ed, which is what they mean by the foundational skills. But basically, it's everything you said, right? Real world, making sure that students know where they might use these skills or these ideas. So But also in this definition, it's of interest to the student. So that's a big point, is to trying to make sure that they are connecting to it and find it hopefully interesting, or at the very least useful. So the big question that we had when we were working on this, and I'll mention who the we's are in a minute, is contextualized instruction effective? How do we know that? What does the research say about it? And what difference does that make to our practice? So basically, contextualized learning and contextualized instruction comes out of constructivism. A lot of you are probably familiar with it, but it basically is just an idea of how people learn, and that they construct knowledge rather than just, you know, us dumping it into their heads. So they're doing the active piece of creating it in their minds. And so they're not blank slates. They come in with experience and prior knowledge, and they're using that in order to develop their new information. So the more contextualized then we can make it, the better, because it's going to connect to their schema in better ways, and it's going to be more interesting, frankly. So the research really says that, or it says that it's promising. It's always hard with different styles of teaching and new strategies to really truly prove that it's effective, because of all of the different pieces that are involved in a classroom. But what they've found with these studies is that it tends to work well as far as they can tell, which is always the caveat. I also think that it's likely to improve motivation, especially when you think about Wlodkowski and adult motivation theory. He says that adults are highly pragmatic learners. So what they really want is something practical that they can use, and what they want is it to connect to their real life. And if they're in a classroom where they're not having those connections, then it can be pretty frustrating for them. So the more we can contextualize, the better. So my advisor when I was in grad school, way back when, actually created this framework, Mary Ziegler from the University of Tennessee, Knoxville. And she was looking through different aspects of research and contextualization research. And when we look at it, there are basically 4 areas that the research looks at. It's content, right? Whether it's program defined or learner defined, who comes up with the content? Instruction, what kind of instruction is it? Are you teaching a discrete skill, or are you teaching meaning making? Learning, is it disconnected or connected? And then materials, are they generic or are they authentic? And those are all things you have to think about when you're looking at whether something's contextualized or not. So she came up with this framework and theorized that you could plot instruction on this framework. And so there's more academic and abstract ideas at the top, and then to the real world at the bottom. The right is directed by the expert or the teacher, and the left is directed by the learner. And now you can have contextualized instruction in all of those areas. It's a little bit easier to contextualize in the real world, but you can contextualize in the academic world. And we're going to talk some about that. So if you look at this one, it's telling us about how we might contextualize in each of these areas. So the top right is academic and expert directed, which would seem to be the least obviously contextualized. But as long as you are hopefully finding that it's interesting, something that would be interesting for your students if you know them well, and you're able to explain how it is going to be useful to them in their academic life. And you might have to do that kind of a breaking down of the activity for them and show them that connection and contextualize it for them a little bit more, do some of the heavy lifting that way in order to create some value of this activity for them, so that they know that they will be using it and how they will be using it and why they will be using it, and that will help increase that value. The bottom right is expert directed and real world. So this is, here's something that you're going to use in the real world, not in a classroom in your future. And I found it for you, and this is why we're going to be working with it. And then on the left side are the learner-directed ones. So you can have learner-directed real world, right, where they bring in something that they need to work with and need some help with it. Or the top, they're bringing in something academic. So maybe from another classroom or something that they've always needed to work on. Any questions so far? I know I've kind of gone through it fast. I don't see any. All right. So this is one of the pieces of the framework. After Mary had created it, when I was there, she asked me to take a look at it and figure out how we could actually use this practically in the classroom. I took it, and a colleague of mine, Amelia Davis, took it, and we discussed it a lot and found ways that we would use it. And we turned it into a paper that was published. So I've got a link to that at the end. Basically, we created this and put some examples of each. So the last slide had the kind of more the theoretical of what it might look like. And then this one has some examples of what each quadrant what an assignment might look like in each quadrant. So for example, with that academic expert, you know, analysis of material from a present class. So if you were lucky enough to know that all of your students were taking biology, right, you could bring in some biology material from another class and talk about it. If you're doing expert real world, maybe pull up some job postings and be like, all right, you know, how would we apply for this job? What does this job need us to do in order for us to apply for it? And learner-directed real world, again, they would bring in something, maybe a lease, tax forms, some issue that they're having. How do we solve this? And then the top left, them again bringing in things from other classes. So biology textbook, I don't understand what photosynthesis is. How do we deal with this? All right, any questions? Okay. All right, so tips for the classroom then. So we're gonna go through each quadrant and take a look at this. So we're gonna start with that academic expert directed, and this is the one that's trickier to think of whether or not you're actually contextualizing because it could end up turning into just, I'm doing this and I've not made any connection as to why the students might need it or how it's going to be useful in the future. So for example, with our workbook example, it could just be totally abstract if you're not telling them why they need to do it. Obviously, the more realistic that it is, the less workbooky it is, the more contextualized it will be. So if you're able to, again, get an assignment from another class that they can work on, that would be more useful. But you can potentially contextualize that workbook for them if you really need to. Okay, so we're going to talk about that one first. So in your handouts link, there's actually an activity document. So I'm going to make this a little bit smaller and go in there, and hopefully I can share this one. Let's see, share. So are you seeing my Google Drive? Hopefully.
Yes.
Good. Okay, thank you. So if you go into the activity worksheet, the first one is an example with this. So we've got a piece of poetry. All of the people that are in your class, you know, are moving on to English 101. So this is a particular piece of poetry that's connected to what they're going to be doing, or maybe is actually a piece of poetry that they will be doing in English 101. So you can bring that to them and basically help them work through it and tell them this is why you're going to be using this in the future. Okay. The bottom right, oh, sorry, so questions on that, the top right with the poetry. I know that this one's the seemingly the least contextualized of them all. Okay. All right. So we're going to pop back over here. So if we were in a classroom all together, I would have you really take a look at that line phrasing and some comprehension strategies. Unfortunately, we're not. So we're not going to be able to really get into that too much. But let's move on. Sorry, I started at the beginning. There we go. So we're going to look at the bottom right-hand quadrant now. It's expert directed and real world. So these ones are things that you think that they need to know that are from the real world. So bringing in job postings, bringing in information from manuals, all of these different kinds of things they might need. So in that document, there's a bottom right-hand quadrant job ad analysis worksheet. So if you're to bring in a job ad, you can give it to them and say, all right, how would we make a resume for this and a cover letter? Right? Let's pretend you all want to be, I don't know, a woodworker, right? What would we need to know? How would you apply for this job? So this is a really nice tool to use. It was created by Nancy Sandoval, and it helps them to figure out what they would need for each of these for each of these ideas, which would help them to then write those cover letters or write their resume. It will help them connect their backgrounds to what they would actually need to do in the real world. Questions about that? Okay. All right. So that's the expert-directed real world. So that's finding the right job. We'd be looking for job-related language, really focusing on that, reading for detail. I'd probably put them in pairs and small groups, maybe even give them a bunch of different advertisements and let them pick instead of us doing one totally for the whole classroom, and then give them that worksheet that would help guide them into what they needed for those jobs. Okay, the next quadrant then is learner-directed real world. So this is where you're asking the students to identify what is it that you want us to be focusing on. So they're bringing in anything that they are having difficulty with. So for this one, I've got an example on that second page of that handout of understanding a lease, because that's something that probably most of them are going to end up having to do if they haven't had to do it already, or maybe don't even understand what they signed. So I actually took a piece of a lease of mine from the past and used it as an example. And so that student can bring it in. You could use it with the whole class. You could just use it with that student and have them say, all right, here's what I'm having trouble with. What does this mean? So for example, there's a hazardous materials one, right? What is a hazardous material? There's also something about maintaining order. I think it's I. The tenants, family, and guests at all times will maintain order in the premises and in all places on the premises, and shall not make or permit any loud or improper noises or otherwise disturb other residents. There could be a pretty robust discussion about what an improper noise is and what what that might mean. So I think that could be a really interesting discussion. I've used that before. It's been pretty interesting. And got the top left quadrant then. So this is totally student directed, but it's also academic. So it's them bringing in something that's related to what they're doing in another class, or something that they know that they need to work on. So I've always been told that I have trouble with my thesis statements. What do I do with that, right? How do I fix that? Or this is something I've been trying to read in biology and I just don't understand it. We need to work on this, please. That kind of a thing. So I didn't have an example of that one just because it probably would have looked fairly similar to the instructor-directed one, because it could just be from another class. But I think you get the idea of where that might go. So, for example, it would basically be based on the student's decision making. This is what I need to work on. This is what I want to get out of it. So I know that was a little bit short, but I was hoping that we could do a little more discussion, but nobody wanted to talk. Basically, I'm going to flip back to the to really look at this framework. The purpose of the framework is to really help you as an instructor kind of plot where your activities are falling. So if you take a look and you look at your course over a semester or a term or whatever it is that you're doing, you can really find, are most of my strategies and my activities, are most of them falling in the academic expert? And maybe I need to try and bring in some from other quadrants. So it helps you be a little bit more balanced. If you're noticing you're not doing anything learner-directed, maybe you want to challenge yourself to try and pull in a few of those. So that's really what the framework is intended for. It is a tool for instructors to utilize when they are thinking about their instruction and trying to increase the ways that we can contextualize in our own classrooms. So basically, I've found it to be really useful in my own classroom. It's pushed me to incorporate more student choice, which is kind of scary sometimes, but it's been really effective. It does mean that sometimes you have to individualize a little bit more, which can be difficult depending upon your classroom size. But I think it also can be used pretty well in other content areas. Now, I think it's a little bit easier in basic skills or adult basic ed because what we're doing a lot is trying to connect more to the real world. So sometimes it might be harder, maybe in a higher level biology class, to do that, or to think about how it might be. You could challenge your students to bring in materials or questions. Or yes, if they have little to no experience, that can be difficult too. But I think it's a worthwhile challenge. If they have no experience with the topic, then I think probably you're going to have to do more of the contextualizing for them. It's kind of creating value for your content. So why is biology important to them, right? Yes, the framework should be in the handout materials. So let me take you there. So if we go back out of this, Demystifying Contextualization handout, so there it is. And I gave you some examples for each quadrant as well. It's also in the article that we published in 2013, which is also in here. It's the second one. So if you want to read the article in more detail, you can.
And we will send that out afterwards, Valerie, too.
Okay, great. But yes, going back to your question about students who don't understand or don't know much about the topic, I think that can be developed. You can also challenge them to find ways that it connects to them or to learn more about it. Yes. Or to learn more about it. So, you know, they're coming into their first psychology class, right? You're telling them a little bit about some of the psychology ideas that they need to know, the terms and the theories. And then you say, all right, well, so what is it that, how can this connect to your life? Are there questions that you have, right? Are there things that you're thinking about that you want to learn more about? Go out and find me an article about something related to psychology or related to this topic that we can bring in and discuss. So it's putting more of the content finding on the student, but it's worth it when it works well, which it usually does, because they get excited about trying to find ways that that they can connect to their own lives. And yes, you're in that folder. There should be a copy of the webinar slides, and I think Donna was going to send it out as well afterwards. Let's see. I don't know if I have much else. Yeah, so we've been already doing questions and discussion. Anything else? I'm glad you're responding well to the framework. Like I say, I found it to be really useful. Any other questions, thoughts, ideas, ways that it could be used that I haven't thought of? I'm sure there are many. Okay. Well, I'm sorry it's short at only a half an hour, but maybe that's a good thing. You can go off and have your lunch. Or ADA. Yeah, I think it would really work with anybody. They may need a little more support in order to use it effectively. But I think if you ask questions about interest, you may need to help them find some of the materials. But I think it could be really effective. Oh, another question. Yeah, I think it can be useful with all different content areas, and I'd be interested to hear if you try to use it with others and you find it to be effective. Like I say, we did most of our looking into the research on contextualization connected to basic skills and developmental ed, because that was our backgrounds. And Amelia does ESL or ELL, so she connected it with that as well. But a lot of what the framework was built upon, I think, was just general contextualization research in general for adults. So it should be useful. You're welcome. A little bit of how I mix it with allowing more student choice in the overall unit and syllabus. Well, I try to, sometimes depending on the class, as the class moves on, I try to use more and more student choice or more and more student directed material. I usually make that a required piece of their grade, so they need to bring in 2 articles or 4 articles or something like that per semester, depending upon the level of the course and their reading levels. Or they need to bring in a particular number of materials just so that they're getting the points for it, which of course some students are very focused on. But I usually find that they're wanting to bring in more than they're asked because it's a unique experience for them. They're not usually asked to make those kinds of decisions. So when I'm planning out my semester, there's usually more content that I'm choosing that I'm trying to contextualize for them towards the beginning, and then it's kind of slowly released a little bit more as we move on. Once they see kind of what we're doing and where we're looking. One of the flexibilities that I tend to have is that I am teaching developmental and adult basic ed, so our content areas other than comprehension or discrete strategies is pretty wide, so they can bring in things of interest that are not connected necessarily to reading or writing. So that's a freedom that I have that others may not. But so you might need to do more of that front loading for particular specific content areas, where if you're teaching, you know, algebra or something, you need to really focus more on algebra initially, before you could get into them finding algebraic either articles or other materials. Actually, in my statistics class in my PhD program, one of our assignments was to find either a biography or something of our own choice about statistics, which was really fascinating for me, being not really a math person. So I got to read a biography of a statistician, which was pretty fascinating. So that also helps to bring in some other areas that you might not get to explore in your particular class and regularly. To young learners, well, I mean, I think it could be useful in pretty much any age level. With younger children, you probably need to again scaffold them a little bit more, and it would be more about their own interests rather than maybe them actually finding the material, although you could work on taking them to the library or looking online to find material that then we could use for the whole class. But I think it could definitely work with younger students or children. When I think back to my training about working with kids, I definitely think it would connect. With adults, it's so much more important to make it practical for them that I think it's the most useful perhaps with adults, but I think that children choice tends to be pretty effective with them, so that could be useful too. Within adult learning styles, well, I mean, the nice thing about this student-directed aspect of the framework is that then they are getting to they're getting to bring in material of their own choice. So it could be more visual or auditory. They could bring in a TED Talk or something for everyone to listen to. So it actually kind of removes some of the pressure on you to find things from different learning styles to bring and present on your own. And they're able to bring in things that resonate with them, which could be really effective. Let's see. I would imagine it would help reduce adult anxiety. I've never really thought about that, but I think that you're right, that there's probably something connected to it. It would help them feel like the things that they're doing in their life are already connected to what they're doing in school. And it definitely does help with anxiety. I've seen it for sure with the expert-driven academic quadrant, because if I can show them how this is going to be useful to them in their future career academically, then it helps them to feel less worried about where they're going next and less intimidated about what they're going to be attacking next, because they feel like they've got that, they're gaining the skills that they need to move into the next level. So that definitely helps. But I think that, you know, even the students directed ones can do that as well. Did I miss any questions? I think I got them all. Let's see. Anything else you'd like to discuss? Or any other thoughts? Anyone want to piggyback on anything I said or take it further? You're welcome to take the mic if you'd like. Thanks. Yeah, it's been nice to have a big framework to really think about contextualization in the big picture, because often you're just told contextualize this, and it's like, okay, well, I understand what contextualization means, and I understand what it looks like in the classroom to a certain extent, but this helps me really look at my big picture of my course and say, am I just coming in with a bunch of, you know, academic and me-driven material that I'm just telling them, you'll need this in the future, you'll need this in the future, but I'm not really looking at the student, then I can feel it out to see if I'm being too lopsided. I don't know that every course needs to necessarily be completely equal in all 4 quadrants, but I think it is helpful to think about where your instruction is being plotted. Oh, good. Thank you very much. All right. Well, if there are no further questions, I'm not going to make you sit here and stare at this cute little girl for the for the rest of the time. But Donna will send it out, I think, and it's great to spend some time with you on Friday. Thank you for coming.